Okay. Now we're good.
Hi everybody, I'm Jason, president of Copperworks Distilling. I'm going to be talking today about malt and malted barley and the Washington farms that we get that malt from. So the first thing I want to explain to you is, what is malt? This is actually part of a series that we're going to be doing every Friday, where we're going to be talking about the different types of processes we do, the ingredients we do, and the people that we work with. So let's get into what is malt. Malt is a process that makes grain fermentable. So any grain, pretty much any grain, can be malted. Corn can be malted, rye can be malted, wheat can be malted. But when we talk about malt, when brewers and distillers use the term malt, they almost always mean malted barley, because barley is the grain that we use to make malt whiskey and to make beer, craft beer. So the first thing is, what is a process and why do we do it? The process is tricking that seed, that barley kernel, into thinking that it's going to grow. And the reason we want to do that is, what a barley kernel is, or any seed is a really thick energy packet to grow a plant. So what's inside of it is a whole bunch of carbohydrates. But we want to make alcohol, and we need to feed yeast simple sugars that they can digest and turn into alcohol. You can't do that with carbohydrates. So we have to actually use the malting process first to be able to get those carbohydrates turned into small fermentable size sugars. So here's what we do. We, being in this case a malt house, so I'm going to talk about some of the partners that we work with here in a minute, but a malt house will take barley, it's grown in a Washington field, they'll get it wet, moisture content comes up in that kernel. That kernel begins to think that it's spring and it's being rained on and it's time to grow. So enzymes in the husk of that kernel break down those carbohydrates into really small sugars. Sugars that it's going to use to grow a plant, to send a little root up and a little stem out. But in fact, we're not going to let it turn into a plant. The malt house, instead of letting it sprout, is going to kiln dry it. So after it's germinated and right before the leaf pops out of the husk, you kill it. It's kind of a sad day, but you have to do it. And you kill it by adding hot air. The slower and cooler you dry it, the lighter the color of the malt. The hotter and faster you dry it, the darker the color of the malt. So if you think about, say for instance, craft beers you can drink from a golden ale, a pale ale, an amber ale, a porter, a stout, they're all malt, but they've been kilned at different rates. They give different aromas, different flavors, different colors. In distilling, we don't get any color because we've distilled all of the alcohol out, but we do get the aromas and the flavors. So we, being brewers who have founded Copperworks, always start with a high quality beer. We just don't add the hops, but we do use a variety of malts. We make two recipes here. We make one that's 100% pale malt. Pale malts are the lightest kiln. They're the ones with the least amount of color, and in fact, the least amount of flavor. They're just a lot of sugar. It turns out that brewers use a whole bunch of different malts. They use caramel malts and crystal malts and roasted malts and dark malts. So we make another beer that's basically like a Scotch ale, and it's got 5 types of malt in it. They're all 100% barley, but some of them are 75% of them are pale malt, and then we have caramel malts and crystal malts and darker malts and roasted malts. Those all become what we call the 5 malt recipe. So we have 2 whiskey recipes, a pale malt and a 5 malt. Both of them are fermented, distilled, and aged in oak. Each one of those topics we're going to go over in depth in other weeks, but I want to get back to the malt for a minute. So it already should dawn on you that it matters the type of malt that you use. Let's talk a little bit about the grains. Come over here, Ethan, and let's look at what we got on the table here. You may recognize that corn is a grain, but it is not the grain that we would use for malted barley. This is the grain that you would use for bourbon. You might use rye to make a rye whiskey. You might use wheat to make a wheat whiskey. You would also use wheat, of course, in baking, and you'd use rye in baking. Look at some of these up here. These are all these different colors of malt, and some of them are really fancy. They have been smoked with different types of woods, etc. What we found really important was to work with local farms. So let's take a look at this. This first bag over here is from Great Western Malting. They're down in Vancouver, Washington. And what's great about Great Western Malting is they were the first group to release a widely available Washington select malt, meaning that everything that is in that bag was grown in a Washington farm. But here's the problem. We didn't know the farmers. We didn't know the variety of malts. A couple of other small malt houses came up. Skagit Valley Malting up in the Skagit Valley. Was created about 5 years ago. Link Malting over right outside of Spokane in Spokane Valley was created. They're all making malt from malted barley, but grown on local farms. Here's why that's important. As you might know, that grapes are being treated by vintners as very special for the variety, very special for the farm that they come from, the terroir, and very special from the year, the vintage. We're trying to treat grain like grapes. We're trying to make sure that we can actually explore the terroir of the same variety of malt grown in two different fields, the same variety of malt grown in two different years, the same variety of or the same farm growing two different varieties of malt, or even two different farms, the east side of the state and the west side of the state. So we're looking for variations in single farm, single variety, and single vintage malts. And the idea is that by presenting these to you as pure expressions, you'll be able to taste a few whiskeys that were just released from one of those malts. Of course, it has to go through fermentation, it has to go through distillation, and most importantly, it has to go through barrel aging. So the lag time between the work that we're doing and the time you get to drink it is going to be between 3 and 4 years. But each one of those releases that's coming out will be a single variety of malt from a single farm, from a single vintage. They'll all be recorded. We've already released 2 of them. I think it was release 19 was our Alba malt. That was grown in the Knudsen farm up in Skagit Valley and malted by Skagit Valley Malting. That one was delicious. As soon as it was in fermentation, we already knew it was going to be different. Once it came out of the stills as white whiskey, it was remarkable how unique it was compared to any other grain we had ever tasted before. So that one actually took 3 years in a barrel. It came out. That was release 19. Unfortunately, most of our releases sell out very quickly. So release 19 is gone, except for a few bottles we have kept for the archive collection that we'll be able to taste eventually when the tasting rooms open. We also did, the most recent one that we did was release 29. That had most of the product in there was called Full Pint. That's another variety of malt grown on a single farm from that single year, the Full Pint, which was a malt that was actually designed and created at Oregon State University. We're looking for the opportunity to work directly with farmers and create those types of malts. So what we're actually doing is going to the malt houses, but also right to the farmers and working with them to grow specific malts. This malt right here from Link Malting, we just finished brewing that this week. This is the 3rd year we've brewed this. It's called Baroness, and it's actually the only farm up in Colfax at Joseph's Granary. It's the only farm that I'm aware of in the world that is able to grow Baroness malt. That grain grows right in Colfax, and that's the only place it's growing. So we're making a whiskey out of that. We've been doing that for 3 years. Bill Myers is the owner of the farm, and it's some pretty exciting stuff. I'm going to go over a couple of the differences of why farms matter. So as you can imagine, one of the things that matters on the difference between the east side and the west side is rainfall. Another thing that matters is temperature. Another thing that matters is soil conditions. So all 3 of these things really do add differences in flavor, in the harvest time, and even in the weather and how that malt behaves right close to harvest. When you're looking at the malt from the east side, then you have two types of farms. You have irrigated farms and dry farms, non-irrigated farms. What we like about the non-irrigated farms is, even though it's more stressful for the malt, that actually is salmon safe malt, meaning that there's no inputs running into the water, and that by not using water from the streams, we're not lowering the water table. So we're also getting certified salmon safe malt from farms that are certified salmon safe farming. That's coming out, probably is going to be about 2 more years. All of the whiskey we put up was in used cask, Copperworks, previously used casks. So they take longer to mature, but the reason we put them in those casks is so that we can really taste the contribution of the malt, not just the contribution of the barrel. There's a few other things I want to talk about this, and then we'll wrap this one up. One of the things that's really interesting about malt from a single farm is that it's risky, it costs a lot of money, and it's difficult to be consistent. Those 3 things, we have to share in that responsibility. We don't want to put it all on the farmer. We're literally willing to take the risk that that malt may not yield as much. But if we're not targeting yield and instead we're targeting flavor, we have a really good chance of making a whiskey you've never tasted. Because I'm going to tell you, the big guys, they're really going to be targeting yield. That is their gold standard, is yield. Our gold standard is flavor. It costs more, it's less consistent, year to year, farm to farm, variety to variety, but that should be celebrated in the same way that you might celebrate that in wine. So we are contracting from, at first when we started, 50% of our malt was grown in Washington. This year we'll be at 90%. So we've got about 10% more to go, and we'll be at 100%. That's for both the whiskey and our vodka and gin. So we're using that Washington malt. It's a commitment we're willing to make, and it's in order to make sure that there's an increasing size of grain shed, and those farmers can make a living, so can the malt houses. So I just want to wrap up by saying that malt is the central flavor of a malt whiskey. It's also the background flavor of our vodka and gin. So even when you taste all those botanicals in a gin, what's giving it the structure and the body for all that to lay over are actually that base of malt that's been fermented and distilled. So everything, all of our bottles say from great brewing comes great spirits, and the reason we say that is because we make a high quality beer with no hops, and that all starts with malt. So thanks, we're going to continue this process. We'll be talking about fermentation. We're going to have some tastings coming up of gin in a couple of weeks. Just watch this space, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.